In the United States right now, roughly 1 in 3 men between the ages of 25 and 34 is living with a parent. Not because of a crisis, not a lost job or a medical emergency, just living there. Bedroom still down the hall, still eating meals someone else cooked, still not quite an adult the way their grandfather was at the same age. Psychologists actually have two competing names for this pattern, and the fact that they disagree is where this story gets interesting. In 1983, psychologist Dan Kiley published a book with a title that instantly entered the culture: The Peter Pan Syndrome: Men Who Have Never Grown Up. Kiley described a specific kind of man, charming, often likable, yet permanently unable to commit to a career, a relationship, or a version of himself with any real weight to it. The phrase stuck, and for the next 4 decades, man-child became shorthand for an entire category of male behavior: immaturity dressed up as charm, job hopping instead of building a career, relationships that quietly stall out just short of anything permanent, conflict handled by disappearing rather than showing up. None of these on their own prove much, but repeated often enough, together they hardened into a cultural picture that started to feel less like an observation and more like a diagnosis. Here's what almost nobody knows about that book. Peter Pan syndrome was never a clinical diagnosis. It never appeared in the DSM, the manual psychiatrists used to diagnose real conditions. Kiley wasn't publishing a study. He was packaging a pattern from his private practice for a general audience, and the label spread through pop culture nearly 2 decades before developmental psychologists caught up and asked the harder question: is this really about individual immaturity, or is something bigger going on? In 2000, psychologist Jeffrey Arnett published a paper that reshaped how the field understood this stage of life. He proposed that industrialized societies had quietly grown an entirely new developmental stage that didn't exist a century earlier: emerging adulthood, roughly ages 18 to 29, sitting between adolescence and full adult responsibility. His argument wasn't that this generation was broken, it was that the entire structure of adult life had shifted underneath them. Go back to 1960. The average American man was married by 23, had a stable full-time job by his early 20s, and was often already a homeowner without a college degree required for any of it. Now, a 4-year degree is often just the entry ticket. Home prices relative to income have climbed far beyond that 1960 worker's world. Marriage has been pushed back nearly a decade on average. None of the old checkpoints disappeared, they just all moved years down the road, and nobody moved the finish line back to match. So a 27-year-old still living at home in 2026 is statistically doing something his grandfather would have found alarming. But structurally, it's close to normal now. What pop psychology once called a character flaw, developmental research increasingly describes as a predictable response to a changed economic landscape. That reframe doesn't erase the original observation, though. There's a real psychological pattern here. It just isn't simply about age or a home address. Carl Jung, working decades before Kiley, had already named this deeper pattern. He called it the Puer Aeternus, Latin for eternal boy, an archetype describing a psychological structure, not a life stage. The Puer Aeternus isn't someone who merely hasn't gotten around to growing up. It's someone who unconsciously resists it, who experiences commitment to a job, a partner, a fixed identity as a kind of small death. Every choice closes off other choices, so keeping every door open feels safer than fully walking through any one of them. That resistance doesn't come from nowhere. The brain's prefrontal cortex, responsible for long-term planning and impulse control, doesn't finish developing until the mid-20s, true for everyone. But a widely cited 2011 study by Holly Lemoine and Tom Buchanan found that helicopter parenting, high parental control, extended well into a child's college years and beyond, was linked to lower self-efficacy and higher rates of anxiety in the young adults on the receiving end. When someone else has spent 2 decades solving every hard problem before it becomes yours, the psychological muscle needed to solve it yourself never gets its repetitions. It's a bit like a kid who's never allowed to fall off a bike because a parent is always jogging alongside holding the seat. The balance was never actually his to lose, so it was never actually his to find either. Put those two threads together, and it's not that a whole generation of men individually decided to avoid growing up. A longer runway before adult responsibility, combined with a parenting style that removed friction from every hard moment, produced exactly the profile Jung had already sketched, minus the judgment Kylie's book attached to it. And this is where the popular version flattens something important. Man-child treats every 28-year-old at home as the same person, but researchers draw a sharp line between two things that look identical from outside. The first is circumstantial delay, someone who wants stability and is actively working toward it, but is genuinely boxed in by conditions outside his control. The second is what Jung and Kylie were actually describing, someone who has the chance to commit and avoids it anyway, not because the door is locked, but because he doesn't want to be someone who's only walked through one door. The real tell isn't his address or whose name is on the lease. It's what happens when responsibility is offered directly. Someone facing circumstantial delay tends to lean into opportunity when it appears, nervous but moving forward, taking the promotion even though it means more accountability, staying in the hard conversation even though leaving would be easier. Someone matching the deeper pattern finds a reason the timing isn't quite right, again, no matter how many times the door swings open. The job offer arrives and suddenly the role isn't quite the right fit. The relationship gets serious and suddenly there's a reason it isn't the right time. It's never a flat no. It's an infinite series of not yets, each one reasonable enough on its own to avoid ever looking like the pattern it's part of. None of this erases what Kylie first named. Genuine emotional immaturity is real. Difficulty with commitment, avoidance of hard conversations, letting other people absorb consequences that were actually his. But the honest version of this story isn't that a generation quietly broke. A pattern that has probably always existed in some people got mixed together with a much larger economic shift, and pop psychology, moving faster than the research, collapsed both into one convenient mocking label. So if you're looking at a man in his late 20s who hasn't hit the old checkpoints, the useful question was never his age or his address. Two men can look identical on paper, same job, same rent situation, same relationship status, and be living through entirely different stories underneath it. One is climbing toward something he actually wants, just later than his grandfather did. The other is standing very still, making sure nothing ever asks him to move. The real question was never how old he is or where he sleeps at night. It's whether he moves toward the door when it opens or whether he's quietly, comfortably, spent years making sure it never quite has to.